Welcome to another attempt at a video lecture that is pre-recorded. It is March the 25th, and I hope you are all staying nice and secluded as you continue to learn about music. We're going to continue a bit in the vein of Monday's video lecture live stream, but we're going to start off with talking about some stuff that the book doesn't talk about. Now, part of learning about the theory behind a lot of these styles involves learning the history of it as well. So we can't learn about a style without also understanding who were the main composers of that style and why did it exist in the first place. Impressionism and expressionism are good examples of that, as well as how most of when we studied the harmonic language of the Baroque, classical, and Romantic period involved us listening to various Bach SATB compositions or various piano compositions by classical composers, and then more complicated things from the Romantic period. It just sort of happened as we were studying those terminologies of the common practice. So we're at a point now where we're going to talk about three styles that are not in the textbook. We already talked about neoclassicism. We're going to talk a bit about neoromanticism and post-minimalism, but I'm not going to go to YouTube and look at examples of these because I don't want to have to deal with copyright strikes every single time I put a video up. And also, there's just not time. I would really just love if you were to listen to these things and hear what characterizes them, because they're fairly easy to comprehend if you already understand the Baroque, classical, and Romantic eras. So first, the neoclassical style period, well, not really period, but the style itself is a return to the simplicity and order of the classical era, with modern dissonance thrown in because it's just the way that things are going to be in the modern era. So in Igor Stravinsky's middle period, so he had his free atonal pieces and his ballets, and then he had and a lot of things like that, and then he transitioned into pioneering the neoclassical period style, and then moved on into serialism. And then Paul Hindemith, Sergei Prokofiev, and Francis Poulenc are also considered to be neoclassical in style. You'll notice a bit of a cleanness to the sound even when there's dissonance. And then Neoromanticism is along the same vein. In fact, some composers like Poulenc are considered to be neoromantic, just like they're considered to be neoclassical. It was a return to the emotional expression of the Romantic era, but there's a simplicity to it that's not nearly as complicated as the Romantic period is in its harmonies and shifting everything and counterpoint and musical ideas. You might hear a complexity of modern sound, but overall it's still following in the same vein as neoclassicism, which is there's a simplicity to it. A great example of neoromanticism is go listen to Samuel Barber, especially his Adagio for strings is a great example of that. And then after minimalism, we had a style of music influenced by minimalism called post-minimalism. And it combined the simplicity and emotional expression of the neo-romantic style with the minimalist style and trying to develop beyond the aesthetic of minimalism. Now, the most notable composer is John Adams or John Luther Adams. But there's other composers. There's Yves Beglarian. There's William Duckworth. There's a lot of composers in this style that we just don't learn about because there's just a lot of them that we know about since it's more recent. Like most of the neo-romantic and post-minimalist composers are still alive and still composing. But we're pretty much in that style period right now is neo-romanticism and post-minimalism. If you want a good example of post-minimalism in its early stages, you want to listen to Nixon in China. It's an opera by John Adams, and it's an example of how the minimalist styles of Philip Glass sort of informed this combination of neo-romanticism and post-minimalism in a way where there's an economy of ideas, but also a lot of emotional expression being used. There's not a lot of examples I can give you right now of current post-minimalism. It tends to be people who grew up in the minimalist style. Most of what's being written right now is neo-romanticism, with a dash of minimalism thrown in as a treat. Now, as I said here, these styles are sometimes indistinguishable, and composers might be classified as part of multiple styles because they were overlapping. In fact, there are multiple times in the 1900s where Neoromanticism might be considered to have started or might be considered to be the main style. But while this was going on, we had things like avant-garde and electronic computer music, all of it coinciding. And we're going to talk about these styles because these are the styles you're more likely to encounter, especially if you're going to be a music educator, conducting any sort of ensembles. You're not going to be doing very much avant-garde. You're barely going to be ever see free atonal or even serialism. It's mostly going to be neoclassicism, neoromanticism, post-minimalism, and minimalism being the parent of post-minimalism. So now let's look in the textbook. We're going to just look through here and we're going to look for examples of Impressionism, Expressionism, Indeterminacy or aleatoric music, and minimalism. This is important because if you are currently in my Music Theory 4 class, or if you're going to take one in the future with me, you will need to know what these look like so that you can identify them on your exam. So first off, we know that this is Impressionism because of the use of the black notes and the pentatonic nature of the melody itself. Now, most of that melody was pentatonic. There was an F natural thrown in here, the leading tone. We're not going to see that in a pentatonic scale, but most of the melody is pentatonic. So we would know that by just looking at the scale degrees of G flat major or E flat minor. We would look then for their corresponding pentatonic scales. But Debussy makes it easy for us. The melody is almost entirely black notes except for the F and this C flat over here. If a melody is all black notes, then we're probably looking at a pentatonic scale. Now let's move on to some more examples of Impressionism. So we look here, and what we're looking at is, again, the melody is black notes. And then also, we see this B sharp, and we see that there is a D sharp minor triad being played here. And when we put in the B sharps, that's a raised scale degree 6. So not only are we looking at a pentatonic scale, if we look at the intervals, it's pretty obvious. We're seeing do, re, so, mi, do, so, la. That's how we are able to spot intervallically that we're looking at a pentatonic scale. But these B sharps are also raised scale degree 6, which makes this a Dorian tonality. And then we look here. This is Impressionism because we're seeing whole tone scale. How do we know this is whole tone scale and it's not just serialism? Well, first off, that's offensive that you said that. And second off, what we're looking at is specific notes. Let's actually look at what the notes are instead of get intimidated by, G sharp, B flat, F sharp. Just look at the notes. The notes are B flat, C, G sharp. Okay, we got those notes out of the way. C, okay, we already said C. F sharp, B flat, we already said B flat. F sharp, G sharp, E. Now we've said a total of how many notes? B flat, C, G sharp, F sharp, E. That's 5 notes. And then over here we've got a D. It's the same 6 notes over and over. So we know that there's a scale being used here because there's only 6 notes being used. Now what's the intervals between them? B flat to C, C to D, D to E, E to F sharp to G sharp. That's all whole steps. So this is whole tone scale. Now if, say, this was hypothetically a take-home exam, which it is, you could also play it on the piano and you would know this is whole tone scale. It's got a very specific sound to it. Those sound like half-diminished seventh chords. And when you just have a ton of half-diminished seventh chords and major thirds all over the place, we're really looking at whole tone scale. Then we look over here. This is an example of Stravinsky, which is the use of modes that are mixed. Mixing our modes is supermodes, and we're not going to talk much about it, but this is an example of one of Stravinsky's neoclassical ballets. And what we're looking at is this is F sharps and B flats all over the place. That is our hint that we're not random, we're using a scale. And if we take a C scale, because C is constantly being used in the bass, and we add an F sharps, Lydian, and B flats, Mixolydian, then this is an example of neoclassicism with Lydian Mixolydian mode being used. Now let's move on to Ravel. And how do we know this is extended tertian harmony being used? So we know it's Ravel because I just said so, but also this is very, there's a wash of sound being used, which means this is Impressionism. And that just looking at measures 3, 4, 5, just looking at these three measures, we're using the same chord over and over and over. So we've got G, A, B, C, E. It's all white notes, and we're using all these notes that fit within a C major triad. Now, if you recall from previous lecture, I believe it was the one I did on Friday, I want to say, of last week, as long as we don't put an F, and we have to correct it to an F sharp into the chord, every other note could fit in a C major chord. Here's C major. I'm going to turn myself down just a little bit. Here's the C major chord with D. Here's a C major chord with A. Here's a C major 7. Here is a C major triad with a 7th, and D and A, which are 2nd and 6th, added in. All of those are variations of the C major triad. Bumping my volume back up. That's all you see here. It's just as long as there's no scale degree 4, this is just a tonic triad. That means we're dealing with extended tertian harmony. This is also an example of a bit of quartal-quintal harmony going on there, which is a neoclassical element because Ravel is also classified sometimes as neoclassical. And over here is bitonality, where we've got two different keys going on. That's pretty obvious to spot, right? And that is Bartok. Okay, what type of plating is being used in this Debussy piece? First off, wash of sound means Debussy. It's all very hazy and diatonic sounding, so that means it's a diatonic Debussy piece. We're looking at the same intervals being maintained. Every time the chord moves, we're just maintaining fourths and octaves. That means that this is, well, this is diatonic planing because there's no accidentals. It's also just the same exact interval, so it fits the definition of real planing as well, where we don't actually change the quality of the interval based off of diatonicism. And then this is quartal and quintal, which means this is neoclassicism, and we're dealing with intervallic relationships. So what we're dealing with is perfect fourth, perfect fourth, perfect fourth, perfect fourth, perfect fourth, perfect fourth, perfect fourth. That is shifting shapes that the tonality is sort of built around. And what we're seeing is a central note of B. B3 is being used as our tonic here. But it's all about shapes. It's about perfect fourths. I don't even have to play it for you. You can see perfect fourths all over the place being moved around. That is quartal harmony being used by the neoclassical composer Paul Henneman. So now let's move on to one more Debussy example. This is another example of diatonic planing because there are no accidentals. So the quality of these triads is going to be relative to whatever scale degree is the root of the triad. So if C is scale degree 1, this is a C major triad. D is scale degree 2, so this is a D minor triad, and it's going to continue like that. The chord is going to maintain its shape, but conform to the diatonic framework of C major. Now we're going to the next chapter, after all the self-tests and stuff, which you should totally do. There's still more. There's still more. If you have motion sickness, don't look. Okay, here we go. Post-tonal theory. This is where we're heading into Schoenberg of the expressionist style period. How do we know this is not serialism and this is set theory instead? Well, it's not because I said it is, but let's look at the way that the phrases are constructed. So the fact that there's a repeated F does not mean it's not serialism, because unless you're a purist, you can repeat a specific note. What we're going to look at instead is note 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we go from that E natural back to G. That shouldn't happen in serialism. We should not be repeating that G natural. So that's our hint that this is actually set theory. So you're just going to look at the notes and see if there's any repetition beyond the same note happening twice in a row. And we keep seeing EG, EG, which means this is set theory because we're repeating a set of the minor third, which is known as 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 3 set. Now, serialism would look differently. If I were to give you an example of serialism, you would be able to spot it by the fact that I'm not going to repeat a note unless it's just that same note twice in a row. So A, B flat, A flat, G, F, G flat, E, C, C sharp, B, D. I've not repeated a single note here. Same thing here. B, C sharp, C, E, E flat, G flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, A. All I'm looking for is whether a note got repeated, and it did not, which means this is serialism, or 12 tone. So let's move on now to chapter 28. New directions. There are two things you're going to look for in chapter 28 when it comes time to identify these excerpts for your exam. First off, it should be very easy to spot aleatoric or indeterminate music, because we're seeing specific little phrases or measures that you can repeat as many times as you want and you move on. This is not serialism. This is not minimalism, although it is a minimalist device. So, and I say that because I've seen people answer all manner of things because they didn't study and they were guessing on this. There's no reason for this to be serialism because there's repetition and there's no accidentals. So how can I get all 12 notes if I don't have any black notes? Except for this F sharp here. And then finally, Philip Glass, Einstein on the Beach, is the example I would use for minimalism. The way that we're going to spot minimalism is there's clearly some sort of tonic going on. This was when the lecture on Monday cut out. I was going to say that F minor right here is its own little tonic, and then E major over here is a second tonic. So we go 1 to submediant, which is 6. So F minor to D flat major. In an immediate relationship, we're going to go down to A natural. And this is an A major, followed by B7, followed by E major, which in the key of E major is 4, 5, 1. Now, if I were to do F to D flat, which is 6, and then do a 5, 1 in F minor, it would sound like this. And then if I were to precede this A major triad with an E major triad, it would sound like this. So now let's listen to what Philip Glass actually did, which is where the phrase shares two separate tonics. It begins in F minor and goes to the subdominant function submediant triad, which is D flat. And then we do 4, 5, 1 in a new tonic that's a half step away, using the immediate relationship between D flat and A natural. You should hear the D flat and C sharp are a common tone. And this is a way we can spot minimalism because triads are being used. F minor triad, D flat major triad, C sharp, A major triad there, sorry, and B7 in an E major triad. That means this is minimalism. Now, there are simpler versions of minimalism that Glass has done that are entirely diatonic. The example given here is some of his earliest music, which is Einstein on the Beach. We listened on Monday to The Hours, which went like this. And that's entirely diatonic to the key of A minor. So you'd be able to spot that because it's diatonic in that case. But more importantly, it's a repetitious use of triads. And that is the main thing you want to look for is, can I analyze this? Not, oh, I'm freaking out, look at all the accidentals, this must be serialism. It means look at the chords. Can you analyze this? Is there a scale being used? Is there a chord being used? If it's a special type of scale being used, you're probably looking at Impressionism or Neoclassicism, depending on how it's being used. If it's a whole tone scale, it's Debussy. If it's like a mode or multiple modes mixed together, it's either going to be Debussy if it's one mode, maybe Stravinsky if it's two of them. In this case, I can analyze this F minor triad, D flat major triad, and so on, which means this is minimalism because there's probably going to be a repeated pattern. So I'll give you an example of how this might be repeated. I would really recommend listening to some tracks of Einstein on the Beach. This is a good example of one, but so there's some other ones where it actually becomes kind of hypnotic, the repetition, and it helps me personally relax. So hopefully this helps you be able to spot these 4 specific styles in the textbook, as well as understand what neoclassicism, neoromanticism, and post-minimalism actually are and what they are characterized as. There's no need to look into the theory of a lot of the styles that return back to a previous style. It's more, you can spot it by listening to it because it sounds kind of like classicism or kind of like romanticism, except it sounds either more simplified in the case of neoromanticism, or it's actually more dissonant in the case of neoclassicism. And that is it for today's lecture. I will see you later.